Hey, Afrophiles, welcome to episode 5 of this interesting podcast, one of the most interesting podcasts that you come across discussing African affairs. Today, I have the privilege of hosting a good friend of mine, Aubrey, who works in tech and is a real estate investor. We are going to talk more about real estate today, more than his work, but it should be an exciting conversation. We will get interesting answers from Aubrey. He's a great guy. As I always say on this podcast, we get only interesting speakers. And so, welcome, Aubrey. How are you?
I'm doing great, and thank you for inviting me to your podcast. I'm very, very excited to speak with you.
Wow. I'm glad you agreed to come and thanks for taking some time. But let's start from the beginning, shall we? I want to make this podcast a little structured now because in the past I would just start by jumping and asking you about your latest investments. But let's start about from the beginning. Where were you born? Where did you grow up, and where did you do your primary school?
Yes, so I was born in Waterfalls, in Zimbabwe. So for anyone who's from Zimbabwe who knows where Waterfalls is, if you know like Parktown area, that's where I
Yep.
was born. And then I lived there for a number of years. And then for primary school, I went to a primary school called Frank Johnson. It's also in Waterfalls, at least
That's
for
true.
first and second grade. And then when I was in third grade, I went to boarding school. So there's a school in Macheke, called Macheke Primary School or Macheke Junior School. So that's why I went for my third to seventh grade. So yeah,
Wow.
that's school.
Well, I went to boarding school at fourth grade, and I always thought I was one of the few people who went early. But you went in third grade. How was that experience? Starting in boarding school in third grade.
Yeah, it was interesting. Like when I think back now, because like a few years ago, I was actually doing some calculations to understand how much time have I actually spent with my parents. And then I realized that I think, I'm 33. I've only spent like 9 years of my life with my parents
Wow.
because I went to boarding school. So when I think of it in that realm, I'm like, wow, going to boarding school, yes, I had a very great experience doing that, and I'm very, very thankful for that. But I also realized how much time I had to spend away from my family. But for me, I mean, I wanted to go to like boarding school at that age. Believe it or
Okay.
not, I did ask for a change. I really loved Friend Johnson for like first and second grade, but then I just wanted like something more, and I figured like if you go to a boarding school, I just thought you'd enjoy it more. I mean, you're away from home, you get to make friends, you live with your friends every single day, and it's just like a different experience. So I really loved it, and I had a very good experience when I was there. Some of like my best school experiences were when I was in primary school.
Interesting. So the last question being on this is you were actually on the side of the river of Mashonaland East or on the side of the river of Manicaland? Because I know Macheke is where the river is actually the boundary for the province, right? Where is this school located?
I I would say National and East, I think.
Okay. All right.
Yeah, because if I remember correctly, my geography is not so great now, but I think it was like, yeah, it was before the river, if I remember correctly, yeah. Because this
Welcome.
school was about 30 to 33 kilometers from like Marondera.
All
So
right.
it's
All right.
it's pretty close, yeah.
All right. Interesting. And after that, you then went over to Marist, and from there, I guess you decided to go to Marist Kutama and not the better school, which is Marist Nyanga, which is where I went to. Is there a reason why you chose Kutama for your high school, and how was the experience there?
Oh yeah, that's spicy. So I'll tell you this. I actually did write the entrance test for Maris Nyanga and I was accepted. So that was
Ah.
definitely one of the options for me. I'll tell you, when I was in grade seven, I wanted to go to St. Ignatius.
Right.
At least in terms of schools, that was my number one. And
Hmm.
then I think Nyanga, like Maris Brothers Nyanga, I think it was number two for me. And then
Hmm.
Kutama was number three in terms of like where I wanted to go.
Right.
But then, my parents got involved, and it just so happened like my grandfather, he felt very, very strongly about Kotama. So then pushed, and he convinced my dad. So I think I ended up at Kotama because of my grandfather's influence. And I remember back in the day, I think the argument was my brother's Kotama was closer to
Hmm.
Harare, to my
Hmm.
family. And my grandfather said he would visit. So he said, oh, it would be a shorter journey. He never visited me when I was in school. But that was the selling point. And then he's the one who advocated. So that's how I ended up at Kutama. And then I think the other argument was pertaining computer science. I think Kutama was one of the few schools which had computer science. I think it was probably one of the pioneers in terms of like
Right,
high school
right.
in Zimbabwe offering computer science during like ordinary level. So that's how I ended up finding myself at Kutama. But if I can tell you transparently, it wasn't like my first choice. I think parents and my grandparents getting involved are what ended up having me choose Kutama because I think St. Ignatius was first, Marish Brothers Nyango was second. And I did entrance tests at like all those places.
So it seems to me that you already had a love for computer science at an early age. Is this something that you bumped into? Did you get any heroes who were you reading, what Bill Gates or Larry Ellison or anyone was doing and you said I wanted to do that? Or was that something that you were just nudged by your parents to look at in terms of computer science?
Yeah, good question. So I realize now that exposure is something which is very important. And for
Hmm.
me, I'm very fortunate that my uncle, that's like my mom's brother, yeah,
Hmm.
he's a software engineer. So when
Hmm.
I was a little kid, I used to go to his house a lot. He lived in like Horton Park, and almost like every other weekend when I was home, I would try to go to his house. And the reason why I went there was because he had a laptop. I didn't have a
Right, right.
laptop when I was like very, very young. And then, so I remember going to his house, and he was very generous. He would let me play on his laptop. So at first, I'll be playing games, playing like movies, and then after a while, I mean that got boring, like being on
Hmm.
YouTube. So I was like, "Hey, you have a laptop. What do you do? How did you get a laptop?" And then he shared with me, he's like, "Oh, I am a software engineer." And I was like, "Oh, okay." He's like, "Yeah, I work for an American company. He's working for like a non-profit at the time." And he's like, "Yeah,
Hmm.
because of my job, they actually gave me this laptop." So as a little kid, I thought, oh, okay. So if I want a laptop, I need to be a software engineer and I need to work for an American company because they do provide computers. And then I also then asked him like what he did in school for him to be a software engineer. Then he told me that like he studied computer science. So that was like my first exposure. That's why computer science for me was something which was like always top of mind because I looked at it as a way to get a free laptop.
Well, that's interesting. And then after that, you decided to go and enroll at Franklin College in the US. How was that process? I understand you were part of the USAP program, which was also under and great program for students in Zimbabwe, being connected to US universities and being helped to get full funding. Talk to me about that process and how you chose Franklin or how you ended up there and how you liked your undergraduate studies.
Yeah. So my journey to the US, I would say it started like when I was at Kutama. And
Hmm.
then there were a lot of people who were like seniors above me who got accepted into the HISA program. So because
Yeah.
of that, I think from the time that I was like in Form 1, I just saw
Hmm.
like, the people were upper six, like they were going to America. And it was like through this HISA program. And I remember at the time at Kutama, what they used to do is if someone got accepted into the HISA program, they would actually put their acceptance letter on the notice board for everyone at the whole school to actually see that.
Right,
So
right.
I remember like all the seniors who went like every single year, I always saw like their names and oh, they've been accepted into this program. So it's something that
Hmm.
like I wanted to also, be part of. So yeah, after I did like my O levels, I applied for the ISA program, and I'm very, very thankful for like my man for starting this like amazing program. Got accepted into it, and then through that program, that's how I was able to like write SATs and also like apply to schools. I'd actually applied to 4 schools, and I did not pick Franklin where I ended up going.
Oh.
Um, yeah, but what happened was I remember it was in December when at
Hmm.
that point, like, I'm done with like applications. I had picked like my 4 schools. I was like, just like waiting to hear back from colleges. But then I remember getting a call from like the ISA program. They're like, hey, we have a professor here who's visiting from a college called Franklin, and then they would like to meet you. So would you be interested in meeting them? And then they said, oh, this professor also went to your high school, Kutama. So like that is why they asked to
Mm.
speak. And then I was like, oh, okay, that's interesting. And I was like, yeah, I'll be more than happy to meet. And then like I remember going to Eastgate, and then I met up with this professor. And then he was a chemistry professor at Franklin. And then he had convinced Franklin College that, like, hey, how about if we offer scholarships to international students so that we can add to the diversity for the school?
Mhm.
And then he had also convinced the school to also like fund like those scholarships. So then
Mhm.
I think as part of that, the school also asked him, like, hey, do you know any students who might be interested? And then it just happened that he was on his winter break in Zimbabwe. I think he'd actually
Mhm.
not been to Zimbabwe for like 10 years since he left
Wow.
Zimbabwe. But then this year he went to Zimbabwe for his winter term break, and then he went to the embassy. And I remember, I think at the embassy when he got there, he shared like, okay, he was a professor, and then he was curious if there were any students who would be interested in applying to Franklin. But you know, in the USAP program, there's probably like what 30 to like 35 kids a year,
Yes,
depending.
every year.
So then they had a lot of kids, but then in so he wasn't sure like who then to talk to out of like all those 30 kids. So I guess like he then said, okay, when I was in high school, I went to Kutama. So for your USAP class for this year, do you have a student from Kutama? And then it just happened that I was going to Kutama at that point. So then they were like, yeah, we do have a student. And then that's how like I ended up like being picked to be the one who got to speak with them. So I met up with this professor, and then we got along very well. I mean, we had gone
Mhm.
to the same high school, so we had that in common. And then I gave him like my SAT paperwork. I gave him like my college essays and everything, my transcripts. And then he went back to the US to Franklin College, and then he submitted my application like in person. And then I think 2 weeks from then, they admitted me, and then they also gave me like a full ride to attend college. So then from my standpoint, I was like, okay, there are other colleges that I applied to, but then I had met this awesome professor, and then Franklin had admitted me. And then my thinking at the point was, well, if I'm going to the US where I don't know anyone, maybe if I go to a school where there's someone who's a Zimbabwean who's also a professor there, I think it might be easier for me to like acclimate and like adjust. So I ended up picking Franklin because of that. And I'm very happy I did because that professor became like, his family became like, my American family to this day. Like, they're like, he's like a dad to me, and his wife is like a mom to me. And now we have this awesome relationship because I got to spend most of my breaks I spend like at their house, or even if I miss like Zimbabwean food, I would just go to their house and like I would always have Zimbabwean food. Now I live in California, they visit me. I go to Indiana, I visit them. So we have like this whole like relationship which started. But yeah, that's how I ended up at Franklin.
Wow, that's an amazing story there. Just how much serendipity and getting people to meet right when it's not all planned, and you would have set your mind on something else, but then something comes along the way and you take it, which is the exciting part of the story. But when you were talking about how now you live in San Francisco and you're working in tech, and they live in Indiana. But as you were going through your college experience, I understand for some of the summers you actually did some internships here in the East Coast on Wall Street. Talk to me about the time that you spent on Wall Street. Maybe for another student who want to sort of consider Wall Street versus you ending up in Silicon Valley. What is it that you didn't like about Wall Street that pushed you out west, or what is it that you liked more about the life out west that made you go to the Valley?
Yeah. So in terms of like my story to go to Wall Street, I interned on Wall Street when I was a sophomore. But in order
Hmm.
to get there, I remember my freshman year I applied for internships. I did not get like any internship when I was like a freshman. That was tough. I ended up getting a summer job. I think I worked
Hmm.
at admissions office at Franklin College. And
Hmm.
then I remember in my sophomore year, probably like around like October, November, and I was still trying to find an internship. I still hadn't landed something. And then another user student like called me. They were like, I think they were like in their probably junior year. They were like, "Hey,
Hmm.
Aubrey, do you know about an organization called NSB, like National Society of Black Engineers?" I
Hmm.
was like, "No, I haven't heard of it." I mean, Franklin is a small liberal arts school, so we didn't have
Right.
like an SB. And then so
Hmm.
he got to think like, oh, you know what? Every year they have a conference. And it so
Hmm.
happened that this year the conference is in Indiana. So my friend
Ah.
was going to college in like Kalamazoo in Michigan. So he said like,
Hmm.
look, I'm coming to Indiana for this conference. You should sign up and go. And then he said for this organization, even if they don't have a chapter at your school, you can actually join online as an honorary member. So if you do that, then you can also still attend the conference. So I was like, okay, what's the big deal about the conference? So then my friend said to me like, look, at this conference, there's more than like 300 companies who will be hiring. So like if you go there, you have an opportunity to actually meet recruiters as well as like hiring managers. So this might be a way for you to like, land an internship. And then I remember thinking, I was like, oh, okay, this is good. Maybe this is the way, right? Because I was trying to land an internship. It was just like very, very difficult. And then I remember in March, uh, I mean, maybe a few weeks before the conference. And then I called my friend, like, are we still on? Like, are you going for the conference? Then my friend was like, no, you know what? I no longer can make it for the conference. And then I remember thinking a big bump, like, oh, wow. Okay, I was gonna go with him, but like now
Right.
I'm going by myself. Maybe I shouldn't go because I just didn't want to go by
Yeah.
myself, not with
Yeah.
anyone. But I actually think like my friend in this case like was an angel because that's just the push that I needed. Because of him, I signed up and I went for the conference. So I ended up going solo. And it also happened that, I mean, when I was in college, at least my sophomore year, I also didn't even have a car at that point. Then the professor who brought me to Franklin, his wife then offered to come and pick me every day to take me to that conference, and then she would bring me back to college. So then I remember going for the NSB conference, and then I remember going to like recruiters. They had like a resume writing like session. I attended that. I actually met recruiters from all those companies, helped me with like my resume and all that. And then afterwards, I attended the career fair which they have at this conference. I think for like 2 or 3 days. And then during this career fair, like literally you walk up to like all those companies. For me, what I was doing was like I knew that not every company hires internationals. So like I shortlisted like, okay, which companies actually hire internationals? Do they have the ability to sponsor for like an H1B and also like eventually like a green card? So like yeah, I shortlisted a lot of companies. And then like I went to speak with them at that point, a lot of tech companies where I went to, I think they'd already filled most of their hiring spots. But when it came to like Wall Street, like banks there, they'd actually reserved spots for NSB conference students. So like they hadn't like fulfilled like all their hiring needs. So like I remember going to like different banks and yeah, I spoke with like a hiring manager. They liked my resume. They also liked the pitch that I had. And I also tell you, a lot of people laugh at me for like having a baby face and saying like I look very young. But I'll tell you this one time, it actually worked for me. Because when I approached this hiring manager who was a partner at a Wall Street bank, he looked at me and he's like, you look so young. I can't believe you're in college. He thought like maybe I'm in high school. So his expectations were low to begin with, which worked in my favor because his expectation was so low. He thought I was young. I didn't know anything. And then he looked at my resume. And at that point, my GPA was also like very high. So he's like, oh, wait, you like little kid. And like, you seem like you're doing more and you're doing computer science in school. So that just then set me apart. He's like, well, I haven't spoken to someone who looks this young who's also like doing this well. So he's like, okay, I would love for you to join my team. So he later told me like, hey, are you free today at like 2 p.m.? You have to go wait for me at this booth. I'm going to interview you. If another hiring manager tries to interview you, you should say no, just wait for me. So I remember showing up to the interview booth. I waited for that like technology partner for a Wall Street bank to come and get me. He interviewed me. And after the interview, he gave me a job right on the spot. He was like, typically like recruiters will give you the offer, will do this, but he's like, I'm just gonna tell you like right away, I want you to join like my team. And then, so that's how I got an offer. So I ended up interning. I did my first summer as a sophomore, and then I went back my junior year. And I had a great experience interning at Wall Street. And for me, I would say that also gave me the break that like I really needed from a career standpoint. Because after that first internship, when I was now a junior, when I was applying to internships, it just became easier for companies to like, get back because now
Because you
they
had
saw
something.
my experience. So like I really appreciate that. I'm very, very thankful for that. And yeah, my experience there was great. And then to answer your other question, like, okay, so why then did I not go back to Wall Street and why did I then join a technology company when I graduated? The answer to that is as I was interning, I had a very great experience. I also met like other students. So I met some like, Africans. I met like particularly there were these two guys I met, one guy from Ghana and another guy from Nigeria. And they were like my mentors when I was interning. And then they put me aside. They were like, hey, look, a few years ago, we're in your shoes and like we're interning here, we're like loving it. You probably like love it so much and you want to come back. But they're like, hey, let us let you in a secret, right? if you come here, it's great. I mean, compared to probably like what expectation you have. But he said, look, a lot of people who are working here, if you're doing computer science or if you care about technology, most people actually want to end up at a technology company. You're still in
Right.
school. So
Right.
if you can, try and go and work at a technology company. And I really appreciate their advice. Then they also
Mm-hmm.
let me in and say, like, look, if you come here, right, you have to apply for like H1B. And when you're on H1B, a lot of like banks, they won't apply for a green card to begin with, right? They would rather have you be on like H1B for like, all 6 years, because then that means you're tied to the company. You can't like easily leave. If you're on a green card, then you might leave. But then they were like, look, if you go to a tech companies, they don't care about that. From the time like you're on an H1B, they'll apply like right away. So from an immigration standpoint, like you can easily get the status, right? And then I remember they also mentioned to me, like, think about compensation too. Tech companies, they were
Mm-hmm.
paying 2 times as much as like, at least for me, the package that like I got to like join a tech company compared to like the package I was gonna get to, you know, work on Wall Street. It was like
Yeah.
half essentially. So then from a commercial standpoint, there was that. So then, I mean, after that, and I was like, okay, I should try and like, work at a technology company. So like that's why like when I went back like for my junior year, I started
Mm-hmm.
applying to all the tech companies. I did like Google, okay, 300 tech companies, and then like I applied to like pretty much like every single one of them.
That is just an amazing story. I mean, it makes sense. It makes sense commercially. I think also, I've talked to a few people who who work on Wall Street as technology or software engineers in engineering positions, and there's a general feeling that such people feel they are second class citizens because Wall Street obviously is driven by financiers who those companies who prioritize their financiers before they prioritize their technology people. But it seems to me that the trends have sort of shifted now. I mean, as we're talking, it looks like there's been some churn in tech and maybe some layoffs. In terms of if you were going to meet a student right now who is recruiting, would you still give them the same advice that tech is better than Wall Street, or should they try to be a little bit much more evaluative, if there is such a word, in their options? Like what is the future now for students who are studying computer science? What would you advise them?
Yeah, yeah. So to be honest, like whenever people reach out to
Mhm.
ask what they should do, to me, I'm like, look, if you're working on Wall Street, it's a great opportunity. If you work at a tech company,
Right.
it's a great opportunity. How I also look at it, just also being in this great nation in America, it's also like a very great opportunity. A lot of people like want to be here. So when I'm
Yeah.
advising people, the first thing that I tell, depending on whether they're immigrants or not, if they're immigrants,
Mhm.
I tell them, like, look, before you choose whether you go to Wall Street or tech company, first just like apply everywhere. Because the first
Mhm.
thing that you need to do is get an internship. Or if
Right.
you're looking for a job, the first thing that you need to do is get a job. And
Mhm.
regardless of just apply everywhere, whoever gives you a job. And then when you now have, let's say you apply on Wall Street, you also apply to tech companies, when you now have those offers on hand, then you can then get to decide, okay, is it better to work for a tech company? Is it better to like work on Wall Street? I mean, there's pros and cons, like, for the different options, also depending on like what your interests are. I'm sure
Yeah.
like if I gotten to like work on Wall Street like full time, I'm sure like I would have a great career and I would have enjoyed it a lot. Yeah, but there's also like, there's pros in doing that, there's also cons in doing that. Even working in a tech company, there's also pros, there's also like cons. And people would also talk about how now it also looks like, some of the things that maybe people left Wall Street to go to tech companies, those things are now happening at tech companies, to your point, right? So it's like, things are changing like a little bit in terms of like how things are. So like, yeah. So if I'm giving someone advice, I say like, look, apply everywhere. What you want is an internship or a job.
Yeah.
If you
Okay.
have offers, then decide to then pick, and then we can have the conversation like for like what are the pros, what are the cons, and then you can evaluate the offers on hand.
Because you've got to have something instead of keeping on desiring. And this brings me to a point. One of the quotes that is rumored somewhere to be one of your favorite quotes, which goes like, don't spoil what you have by desiring what you don't, but remember that you want what you have was once among the things that you only hoped for. Can you unpack that for us? Like, what's happening there in the quote, and why do you like it so much?
Yeah, I like this quote it speaks to me because I think at different points in my life, sometimes it's easy for me to just like want something else.
Right.
Like when I came to America, right? The first thing like when I was in Zimbabwe, is like I wanted to come to America. When I was now in America, I'll tell you, when I went to like Franklin College, I had a great experience there. But when I was applying for jobs, right, it was a little bit harder. So I remember sitting there like, oh, what if I went to like other schools? What if I went to like Ivy League schools? Like, what if, think about like those what ifs. But then I had to then like stop myself and say like, look, right now, what I was currently like living, being in America, being at Franklin, is like what was my prayer like years
Right.
ago.
Right.
But
Right.
now when
Yeah.
I'm in that situation, I'm not desiring something else that I don't have, but I'm forgetting that what I have now, at some point, that used to be my prayer. So it's like, why should I spoil what I have? And I mean, things always have a way to work out. So for me, I really like that quote because at every instance, it just like helps ground me to say like, I should always be grateful for whatever I have. Because at some point, I probably wished I would be in that situation. So I always want to have that reminder. I actually have this bracelet, and I don't know if you can see. It actually has the word like grateful. Um, like yeah, because for me it's like something like I always try to think about like whatever is going on, I should always like be thankful for like where I am now. Because there's a lot of people who probably would also want to be in that situation. There are a lot of people who probably are praying to be in that situation, but they're not. But then when you're in a situation, it's always easy to look at what you don't have. And like it's always easy to look at people maybe who are doing better than you compared to like being grateful and just like being thankful for like what you currently have. So that's why I like that quote because it just grounds me.
And that sort of speaks to sort of living in the moment and also actually living life instead of just pursuing aggression but actually being thankful, which brings me to the second quote again, which is everybody dies but not everyone gets to live. What's happening in that quote again? I mean, some of these things that you spew out, I mean, I pause and I say, wow, that's actually true. I mean, we all die, but living is actually a different experience that's experienced differently depending on how you prioritize things in life. But how does that speak to you?
Yeah. So how this speaks to me is like, at least for me as I go through life, I just don't want to just be surviving and just not taking time to like really, really enjoy. Because like, we get one shot at this thing called life. So for
Yeah.
me, in that quote, it's a reminder for me to just like maximize like my experience, like live each day and make sure that like I'm getting the best that I can get out of like each day, any experience, whether big, whether small. I just want to make sure that like I actually get to enjoy. Because one of the things that I realized, especially like earlier on when I started my career, I was always wanting the next thing for like whatever comes, what's coming next. And then when I got to a place, then I realized, sometimes like yeah, you celebrate for hitting a specific milestone, but then I realized more often than not, it's actually the journey, which is like, more important compared to like that destination. Because at that destination, once you get to the top of the mountain, you're not looking for another mountain to climb. So then I then realized, okay, every single day, I need to actually like live life because at the end of the day, it's just all about the journey, not necessarily like the milestone. And it also goes to like one of my favorite songs is like I Lived by like One Republic. Because like for me,
Yeah.
it's like, yeah, I think at the end of my life, I just want to say, you know what? I took every moment that like life gave me and like I just enjoyed and I did everything that like I wanted to do. So that's my philosophy. I want to make sure that I get to enjoy this life and not just like go through life. Oh, I want this, just chasing all those milestones and chasing all this like destination. I just want to get everything that I can get out of life because we get only one shot.
In terms of milestones, what's the milestone in relation to your facial hair? What's happening there? I mean, you always have people saying, "Oh, you went to Zimbabwe and you got a haircut. Sounds like you met your mom or something like that on your social media." But what's the target? Are we gonna see you with dreadlocks sometime soon, or do you grow your afro and then cut it off and start again? What's the cycle?
That's good. So when I came, I mean, being from Zimbabwe, at least for me, my mom, I mean, she always made sure I had short hair, and she still doesn't like subscribe to like men having like long hair. But at some point now, she has given up. I have tried locks, and I mean, I've always had respect for people with locks, but now I have way more respect for people who have locks, and even people who just like do dreads and all that stuff, because I realize those things are painful. I got my locks in America the first time I had locks, and I felt like it wasn't like that bad. It wasn't that painful. Then I went to Zimbabwe, and then I went to a hairdresser. They who did my locks, and the way they pulled them. After that, I was like, never again. So I came back. It was so bad that when I came back, it took like a scissors and I cut all the locks that I had. So
Ah.
so I think I have some trauma from that experience. So I'm not gonna do locks anytime soon. I was thinking of like braiding my hair, but to be honest, I actually set up to get like a haircut tomorrow. So like if we had had this conversation like next weekend or something, I'm getting a haircut. So right now I'm just going back to like short hair. I like long hair, but it's still hard to maintain. And it's like you get a lot of like split ends and all that stuff. So like I don't enjoy
Yeah,
that. Like short
that's the
hair.
stuff. Well, I'm very glad that we got to film the podcast before, before you actually did that unforgivable thing of cutting down your hair. But, another thing, just to mention this and shout out your mom, as you know, but as listeners would not know, your mom officiated my sister's wedding in Zimbabwe, and I met her, and, so it was great, meeting her under those circumstances when I was walking my sister down the aisle. So, you have a blog where you document a lot of your experiences, and one of the experiences that you documented, the series that I really liked, is when you're talking about your immigration journey and how you got to go from F1 student to green card. And so for a student, some student who is an international student in the US who wants to look at this, in a summary, what would you say the process entails? How hard is it for one to naturalize, and how proactive do they have to be with their HR department to help them actually get that goal so that they won't be tossed out of the country one day?
Yeah. Well, thank you for reading the blog. I didn't realize that someone is actually reading this blog. Yeah, I started the blog because I just wanted to share. And what I realized was a number of times people would ask me, how do you do this? How do you do this? So in order to like scale, I figured, for the questions that I usually get from people, let me just like have a blog and then I can just like say
Yeah.
that. And hopefully people find that useful. So in a nutshell, when you're going through the US immigration journey, where it starts is if you come as a student, then you're on an F1 visa. And then for everyone who comes and studies in the US and graduates from a US college or university, you're given at least like 1 year that you can work. It's called like OPT. And then for this 1 year, you can work in your field or outside your field. It doesn't matter. And then for people who do what's called STEM, like science, technology, engineering, and math, then those people are allowed to extend their OPT. And I think it's by like another 2 years. So then when you file that extension, then like you have to be doing a job, which requires you using the things that you learned in school, but just to be like understand. And then so different companies they handle this differently. There are other companies who don't hire internationals, other companies. So what I would suggest is if you're coming to the US as an immigrant and then you're interested in staying in the US like afterwards, then you have to first think about, okay, what are you going to study? Because what you study also determines like, what your chances are. If you don't do STEM, that means you only have 1 year to work in the US. And then that 1 year, you can apply for what's called like H1B. But then if you don't get it, then you have to leave the country. If you do STEM, if you come here, you essentially have 3 chances to apply for like the H1B visa, which is like the work permit. So depending on what you study, you either give yourself 1 shot or you give yourself 3 shots. And then also, this is where the company you work at is also important, right? Other companies, if you apply and you don't get that H1B visa, which is like a work permit, some companies are generous to send you to another location in another country. Then they look for a role for you there, they pay for your expenses going there, then they can bring you back on an L1 visa. But other companies, they don't do that. So if you're an immigrant, if you think about jobs, I would encourage you to think about, doing a program which gives you more chances and also working for a company which is willing to support you if you don't get that H1B. If it works out that you actually get that one H1B, then the next step is like applying for a green card. Green card is very good because once you have a green card, now like it gives you like more opportunities. Because when you're on an H1B, you always have to work for a company which is gonna sponsor that. But when you're on a green card, then at that point, you can work for whoever you want, and you don't have to be working in the field that you got your degree in. And then you're also allowed to stay in the US, even if you don't have a job. So trying to get to green card is also something like I encourage people, like as quickly as you can. For me, I was fortunate that when I graduated, I was on OPT, and then I didn't even need to use my OPT extension. The first time I applied for the H-1B, I got it right away. It's a lottery. There's about 85,000 spots every year, and then I think 65,000 apply to people with only a bachelor's. The other 20,000 applies to people with like a master's degree, or like PhD. And then, so
Yeah.
for me, I was fortunate that like I got the H-1B right away. And I kid you not, the day that my H-1B started working, that's the day I filed for my green card application. I remember as soon as I got the H-1B, I talked with my manager like, hey, I would like to apply for the green card. Would you support this? And I emailed our company lawyers to also like help put that petition for me because I wanted to be on a green card because it just gives more peace because there is like less restrictions. And I was fortunate that like I got that. And even the green card process, depending on which country you are from, it also determines like how much time it took. For me, there's not as many Zimbabweans like in the US. So like yeah, I got my green card in like yeah, it didn't take too much time. I think it was like less than a year from the time that like I filed for the green card to the time that I got it.
Moving on to just your personal life and something else you're doing. You seem to travel a lot. You have been to many cities in the world. What's the most memorable city that you have been to, and where have you had the best food experience?
Whew, that's a that's a tough question. I say this because I've traveled to a lot of places and I've had very unique experiences.
Mhm.
So in terms of like but I think I have to go with like Italy. When I
Mhm.
went to Italy, I spent some time in Venice, and then I went to
Mhm.
a small town called Tropea, and like
Mhm.
I had an amazing time there. Tropea, I don't think it's a tourist place. This is a place where Italians go to vacation, so it's like a local spot. When I went there,
Right.
people barely spoke English there, so I really liked that because there were not many people. It was an amazing experience. We ate a lot of amazing food. I remember we talked to like some like local guy who had his own boat, and then like yeah, he took us like out on his boat for like is it 4 hours? He cooked like pasta and meat and all that. It's the best pasta I've ever had in my life. But it was just like something which like yeah, we just approached someone. They took us on their boat. We couldn't even like converse very well. They didn't know English. We didn't know like Italian. But overall, it was like an amazing experience, and I also got to do that like with my fiance, and like my mother-in-law, which was like yeah, it was amazing. So that's one of like my favorite things. I would say like when I travel, one of my perks, my friends will laugh at me for this is I have a lot of friends who are also from different countries, so I don't like to plan. So what I usually do is like when my friends are home visiting their families, I tend to then take along and visit them. But now the pressure is on them to make sure I have a good time. Then they show me their country. So I've done this. Like I went to France and I visited like my friend and like I live with this family. So I got the local experience. Because every time I'm traveling, yes, I like tourist things, but I also value the local experience. I want to learn about the culture and what do people actually do, not necessarily like, the tourist side. So by traveling with friends who are from these countries, it gives me that local experience because then I can get to actually live with their family and to just like eat normal food like they do, go to the market. I did that for France, amazing time. Did that for Norway, had an amazing time. So I try to do this like with my friends too. And then if I'm not traveling and visiting my friends, then at least my partner tends to, plan the trips. So she's very nice and kind for doing that.
Wow, it seems like she's doing a great job. So she's the one, just for the record, who you went with to Italy, or were you with different friends?
Yeah. So when I went to Italy, I went with my partner and her mom. And then my
Okay,
partner planned the whole trip and we had an amazing time.
that's amazing. Where did you guys meet, by the way?
We met when I was in college, but then like we didn't
At
date.
Franklin.
Yeah, yeah. But then like we started dating like later on, like after I graduated, and then like I was now working.
Interesting. And in terms of, just the travel all over, I think one thing that I tend to hear about, people talking about in terms of, people who are from Africa who would have migrated to the US is just the headache of, the logistics, the visas and everything. How do you handle that? Do you just mail your passport and make sure you always have visas, or do you have go through a long planning process where you have to actually make sure that you can visit these many countries?
Yeah. Oh, that's a very good question. And the struggle. I remember one time, I forget if it was in, was I flying through Germany or something? I had the passport control officer hold my Zimbabwean passport, and then they just looked at me. They're like, "Oh, I'm sorry." And then they were talking about like, "Wow, I see like you have to get a visa pretty much for almost like every country you visit." And I remember like joking, and then I said to him like, "Hey, I'm sure you really appreciated how colorful my passport is because it's probably the most colorful passport you ever hold. Because in my passport there's so many visas for so many different countries." So yeah, it's always like a struggle trying to travel and like making sure you visas, but I just try to plan as much as possible so that I can have the appropriate visas. But I've gone to so many like consulate offices now, just getting visas, and it's tough and it's hard. But when I do apply for visas, I try to make sure that I get like long-term visas. At least this was when I was traveling, like as a Zimbabwean. Fortunately, I also became like an American citizen, so like now I get to travel on the blue passport, which is like slightly easier. When I'm traveling with my partner, I can tell her like, look, you don't realize like like what this means.
How tough it is.
Yeah, because like it's a game changer because now you just think, okay, I want to go to Europe, I want to do this, and you just show up, and you don't even need to like apply in advance, or like you have all these visas. But yeah, when I was on a Zimbabwean passport, I always made sure that I planned ahead. And then my other thing there was I would try to get like long-term visas. For example, like for the UK, I applied for like a 10-year visa, and I still have it to this day because I didn't want to have to
Right.
go to the consulate like so many times. So if countries allowed long-term visas, I'll try to like apply for those. They tend to be expensive, but I think it's worth it in the long term, in my opinion.
That's great. Let's do a quick fire round, shall we?
Yeah,
Skiing or safari?
Safari,
NBA or EPL?
EPL.
Best airport in the world?
There's an airport in Turkey, like in Istanbul. Istanbul, yeah.
Favorite national park in the world?
This one is tough because I did like a 2-year like road trip, and like
Mhm.
Glacier National Park is my favorite park.
Worst border control or immigration experience that you have ever had? You can name you can name the continent if you don't want to name the country.
Yeah. So thankfully, I haven't had as many bad experiences, but I'd say the worst one that I've had was in Asia. I remember showing up, and then I remember being asked for my passport, and like I showed them I was using a Zimbabwean passport, and then they didn't believe. Like they looked at me, they're like, "Well, you look way too young," and like I was going there on a work trip, so they didn't believe that like I actually like worked. And then they also claimed that like my company didn't have an office there when we clearly had, and I was there on a work trip. So then I had to go for like additional questioning, and then they were asking me how much like I bought tickets for and all that. And information where they wanted like the exact dollar amount, like even like round.
0.76. That's what they want.
Yeah, and I couldn't remember the actual dollar amount because it was a work
Yeah.
trip. And yeah, so that was like my worst immigration experience. Like I had gone to like Asia, and then I had traveled just like, working with like the consulates to trust that like, yeah, I was actually working. I'm old enough to be working. And I was also like, visiting our office, which actually existed, but they were trying to tell me it didn't.
Wow. I'm sorry about that. But let's talk about some of the work that you're doing in terms of just the giving back. I know you mentioned in terms of USAP and how you're very grateful, and I of course am also grateful for the opportunity that USAP gave us. But you have been doing some other stuff on your side. You co-founded a scholarship. I think it's called the Tapua International Student Scholarship Fund. How is that going? And if someone is listening and they're interested in it, what's sort of the application process for them to be considered?
Yes. So yeah, I really do believe in like giving back. I believe, in the African proverb, like it takes a village to raise a child. And I believe like for me to be here, all the opportunities that I've gotten, there's a lot of people who have helped along the way, people that I knew and people that I didn't even know. For me to end up at Franklin, like a professor that like I had no relationship with, they took a chance on me, and then they helped me. So because of that, like I always want to give back. So like yes, it's part of giving back. The Zimbabwean professor I mentioned and myself, we co-founded a scholarship called the Tapua International Scholarship. And then what we do for the scholarship, like right now, is we currently afford the scholarship to any student with like African heritage. So right now our fund is about $25,000. Like last time I checked, our plan is to grow. Our long-term vision is to grow this fund so that it can actually afford to pay the full tuition and room and board for a student. We're not yet there.
Right.
So like right now we cover like other educational expenses like room and board. Typically Franklin College, they usually give international student a scholarship maybe like once every 3-4 years. And then when that student is there, then we help offset some of the costs that they currently have. And I'm very thankful to a lot of like my friends and family and the Zimbabwe professors' friends and family who have also contributed to help us grow that fund from $0 to about 25,000 that we currently have. And we plan on continuing to like donate and grow with the plan to make it like, self-sustaining. And we love that it's an endowment. So like the money that like we have now, it's like it's set in perpetuity. Like we just live off like what is the interest from that funds because we want this to be something that stays on for forever.
Wow, that's amazing. Thank you for doing that. And I'm pretty sure at some point this is gonna grow into something big that will that will help many more students achieve their dreams. But let's take a pivot and talk about real estate, which is my favorite topic and something that you're very very much involved in, at least in Zimbabwe. Can you tell me about sort of just as a background, what you're doing in terms of real estate, in terms of, to start with, the partnerships, right? Because as we have established, I mean, you're sitting here in the United States and you have projects that are going on in the ground. I understand you work very closely with your younger brother, but you also have contractors who you talk to directly. How do you establish these relationships, and how do you make sure that everything is working well, even though you're trying to sort of lead it remotely?
Yes. So yes, if you're listening and you want to buy property in Zimbabwe or you want to build, please contact me. My company is called Oshi Properties. Our services are we develop and design like luxury modern houses. So we have our own offerings. So if you're interested in that, you can buy from us. But if you also have your own vision that like you wanna build, we also like help. If you need any help pertaining to how do you even look for land, how do you buy land, we also offer consulting services. Like we have an hourly rate. We also offer the first 30 minutes for free. So contact me if you like need any help there. We can help, coach you pertaining to like how do you buy land when you're building, how do you pick a builder, what are things that you need to think about, how do you source materials and doing all that stuff. But then how did we get to learn all those things? We got to learn all those things because I've always been interested in real estate. So to date, we currently own 2 houses, and then we also have like property like land that we bought. We also intend to do like 6 cluster homes, which are actually selling. And then
Yeah.
so because of this, like I've always been interested in real estate. And if I have to think about like why was I interested in real estate and how did I begin to be interested in it, it's because like my own grandfather, he used real estate like as a vehicle for like growing like wealth and also to help like support the family. And my grandfather was also generous enough that like when his kids grew up, he actually gave his kids houses. Like my dad was fortunate
Right.
to have a house from his father. So for me, seeing that, I think that was like the first like introduction to like, oh, real estate is cool. Like you can use that. You can help like your own kids by setting them up. And then also, even like when you're long gone, your family can also have that and still benefit and getting income from. So for example, when my grandfather passed away, like my grandmother could live off like all these real estate investments that like my grandfather had done. So for me, that was like my first interest. But as I grew older and also like starting to learn, right? And also from all the travels, I also started getting exposed to like different designs. I really like modern architecture, like modern designs. So it just like made me be more interested in that. And then I started thinking like, oh, I like creating and building. So like I look at real estate like, okay, I can think about ideas and then I can actually like make that happen. We have a luxury home we're currently doing in Arlington Estate right now. So like yeah, in literally for this piece, like I saw a design that I really liked from Pinterest, and I was like, this looks like a nice modern house, and like I'd love to do the same, and I would love like my own take and spin on it. And then I work with architects and designers, and like made it happen. So for me, it's just something which is like very very interesting. And then like yeah, whilst I was building and like buying my own house in Zimbabwe, I then realized that I've learned a lot and I also enjoy this. So like, why not actually start a company? And then starting the company for like various reasons. First, because I enjoy it. And then, so I want to get to develop like a lot of houses and I see myself being a real estate developer, like in the long term. Then the other thing I also realized that when it comes to real estate, for some reason, at least for Zimbabwe, it was so hard for me to get started and figure out like information. How do you even buy land? How do you make sure you're not scammed? How do you like contract like a builder? How do you contract like a civil engineer, a structural engineer, and all that? And all this information wasn't readily available. A lot of people that I've talked to when I wanted to like get into real estate, it was like, oh, especially if you're doing it from the diaspora, you get scammed. There's all this like negative and bad things. So I also figured, okay, if I start a company, first I can offer the things that like I've always wanted. Then I can also help other people and like coach other people for like how to do it. That's why through the company we also offer this like help, and we'll also be publishing like content just to like make it more accessible to other people. Then the other thing is I also love giving back, and by setting up this company, from the process that we'll have, we'll also dedicate a percentage to also go towards like giving back to the community. So I figure, through real estate, I can get to do things that like I really love, I really enjoy. I can also give back, and I can also just like help contribute to the economy. And in Zimbabwe, there's also like a lot of reports which show that we have very very few houses compared to like how the population is growing. So we need like more houses. So I can do my part by helping contribute to that.
And in terms of scouting for land, what factors are you looking for here? I mean, you mentioned Arlington Estate, which is quite upmarket and enclosed and stuff. But are you really just targeting the new up and coming estates, or in other neighborhoods are you also scouting for stuff as well? Considering proximity to services like hospitals or shops, or maybe proximity to universities for student housing. Like, how are you in terms of what you're developing? Is it just residential for families, or do you also think that you expand at some point into something else?
Yes. So right now, as a start, because we're into like modern luxury, so we're trying to figure out like, what are the best places like we can do residential homes, at least for now, as a start, as we're building up this company. So for this phase, we're looking at like what are the up markets which are there, and I guess people like areas people would call like prestigious areas like right now because we like modern, designs and modern architecture. So
Yeah.
then that is the market that we're currently like targeting. I think like in the medium term, as well as like long term, we wanna go into like apartment buildings. Like making sure that like we have like more like luxury apartment buildings that like we can then offer. That's what like what targeting is like for medium and like to long term. And then like if you think about like long term, we want to get into like commercial real estate. So doing like all those like big buildings, doing like malls. So essentially just like all the standards that like we see in Western countries, we believe that we can also give to the Zimbabwean community by making sure that we can have those things in Zimbabwe as well. So like that is our plan. We're targeting upscale luxury and like modern architecture.
We'll still come back to real estate, but this is an interesting side note that I just need to make sure that I clear out of my head because it keeps popping up. We also see in the Western world that some real estate developers end up having political ambitions and even become presidents of countries like in the United States. Do you have any political ambitions of your own, or you're really just going to stay with real estate and just become a developer in Zimbabwe?
Yeah, no, the plan is to become a developer. That's about it. Yeah, that's as far as I
Oh,
can go. When it comes
all
to
right,
that's
that's fine. I just needed to make sure that you're not following a well-written script to studying real estate and ending up in the state house. But you know, given you said the first 30 minutes is free, so I'm gonna try and milk some consulting here. But if someone is sitting in California and for at the very least they need to find land, a lawyer, and a construction company, right? How do they go about scouting for land before they maybe send someone who is on the ground to actually view the land? How do they narrow down the land? How do they narrow down the lawyers, and how do they narrow down the construction company or the builders?
yes, great questions. So the first thing which I would encourage everyone to do before like you start like actually purchasing something, first figure out what is your budget. Because at the
Right.
end of the day, like budget is going to detect like what you can get. So figuring out, okay, what is the budget that you currently have? And then also based on that budget, figuring out what are the things that you're interested in. Uh, are you someone who's interested actually buying like just like land and then you develop on your own? Or are you interested in buying an already built house? There's
Hmm.
pros and cons for those different like routes you can take. Personally, having gone the route of buying a house in Zimbabwe and also having gone through the route of like building houses in Zimbabwe, we prefer building. Our reasons
Right.
for trying to build is, well, you can actually find the exact land like that you like, and then you can customize the house to your liking. From our own journey from buying in Zimbabwe, what we first a lot was we saw a lot of like houses which were priced very, very high. But when it comes to like the actual like interior designs, they were not necessarily stuff that like we actually like really wanted. So we, especially at the price points that we're trying to target, figured
Hmm.
if we construct, then we can be able to meet the budget we need. So like yeah, first I would encourage you, think about what is your budget. Think about if you're trying to buy an already built house or you want to build your own house. And then you then have to also then, once you've decided that, the first thing that you need to then do is like, if you're looking into property in Zimbabwe, go to www.property.co.zw. I like
Hmm.
this site because all the agents that like operate in Zimbabwe, they also list their listings on this specific site. So you can see
Yeah.
from different like listing agents, they'll have their properties there. And then on this site, you can also filter for your budget, the size that you're looking. You can also filter for the location. So that's what I encourage, want to do. And then from that, let's say you enter in, let's say I want to spend $100,000, for example. Let's say I want to buy in Arlington. You get your list of all the properties, like the land in Arlington, which is maybe like under that price. Then the next thing that I would encourage someone to do is like read the descriptions for all these listings. So let's assume you go into like you want to buy land. On the description, not if they have a title deed or not. Our own philosophy is if there's no title deed, we don't do that deal. Because this is where like people run into problems or issues.
Hmm.
So our recommendation is first, read all the listings that you populate, figure out if they're title deeds, and figure out what is the type of title deed that is actually there. Then if you narrow it to like a few things that you're actually interested in, then I would suggest you also then reach out to those like realtors or sellers. When you reach out, ask them about the details. Ask them about like what is the cost of that property. Ask them like what are the payment terms for that property. Also ask them why the seller is selling. It's also good to know. That also like gives you a sense for like what is actually going on. And then if you're very happy with like, okay, you know that there's a title deed, you know what is the price, you know what are the payment terms, and you know the reason for why they're selling. Then I also suggest that you then, if you're in the diaspora, you can ask your relatives or your parents to then go and actually see the site. Never do any deal without actually going on site. Because when you go on site, you can actually inspect and see what is currently going on. And then you can also go and see like, is there water? Is there electricity? Like, do they have like sewer facilities and how all that works? Because all these things like will be very, very important. So you have to go on site. I would even recommend if let's say you send your family, also send a friend, someone else, so that like you have like different opinions from like different people. If you have done that step and then you still are interested like in moving forward, then the next step on our end is you then have to engage lawyers. Never do any deal yourself without engaging lawyers. Because again, this is another point where a lot of people run into trouble because you don't want to pay the seller directly. We don't like suggest that. When you're doing payments, you should do it through like escrow. So like yeah. So you need to set that up. But before you even get to there, you want to make sure that you have a lawyer, and then the lawyer will do their due diligence to make sure that the land that is actually being sold belongs to the person who's actually selling that. They also need to make sure like if there's any debt or like liens attached to the property, you need to be like aware of that. So your lawyer will do all the due diligence to make sure like everything is legit and everything is good. And only when a lawyer says like everything checks out and everything is good, will you then proceed to actually do any payments. But then the payment should also still be done through like trust accounts. We don't encourage doing like cash payments. And then how do you choose the lawyer? What I suggest is you can ask friends or family if they've done any real estate like transactions and see if they have any lawyers that they worked with who like you can trust and work with. Or you can also reach out if you're doing this in Zimbabwe. You can reach out to me. I have a list of lawyers that I've worked with for all the properties that like we have obtained, and then the lawyers I would definitely like recommend. We're more than like happy to share that. But yeah, it's also good to make sure like you're working with also like legit lawyers as well because you don't wanna run into trouble. So like that's generally like the process and like what I would encourage.
And then in terms of the deeds process, I understand sometimes there are, independent deeds, or sometimes there's council land where, maybe the deeds will come later. What's the mechanics around that, and what sort of, like title are you specifically, advising clients in a consulting session to look for?
Yeah. So different people, that's a great question. Different people go for different deeds. They're like comfortable with different
Mhm.
deeds. They're like session deeds, there's like council deeds and all. Personally, for us, for all the properties that we go after, we look for like a proper just title deed. Like we need
Right.
the property deed to already be there. Because sometimes this our experience. We've gotten property before where there was like a subdivision, like a permit. So they didn't have like the actual title deed, but then they had like a subdivision permit or something like that, council permit that they had. And then from the time that we bought the property until we got like our actual title deed, it took about 5 years. So
Mm.
you don't want to wait. So personally,
Yeah.
if you're going through this process, what we encourage is the actual proper title deed, where after you exchange your money, you're getting the title deed, and then you can do whatever. That's what we go for. That's what we recommend. However, the other types of deeds that like people can do, if people are interested in that, I mean, they can go with that, but make sure like you understand what are the pros and cons, because like for some of the other title deeds that you have, it might be hard to like really prove who the owner is. There might also be restrictions in some of the deeds, like you end up going that like you have to then maybe build a house which is worth a specific value for you to get your title deed, but then you might then run into issues. What if you do that? What if the owner dies before like all those things like haven't happened? So that's why for us we just like say you need to have like a clean proper title deed. That's what we recommend. That's what we tend to go after.
I know you talked about, Pinterest and, getting some of your inspiration online as you're just, browsing through stuff. But who actually does, the designing, the architectural work and maybe the interior design for the properties that you're working on?
Yeah, yeah. So for us and like for my company, how we go about
Mhm.
it, first like I decide like, okay, for the land that like we buy, I decide like what kind of property do you want to put there and like what do we want those to look like. So for me, I like modern architecture, I like minimalism. So I first search online, go to different sites. I really like Pinterest. I never thought I'd find myself on Pinterest. But like lately I'm always using Pinterest because they have all those cool designs. And then so what I end up doing is like I find inspiration from Pinterest, right? And then I then collect like, what are the design that I like for like the exterior and even the interiors. And then from there, what I end up doing is I then like look for architects to do this. There's different ways to go about like looking for architects. I've worked with architects in Zimbabwe, and then the pros being they're on the ground. I've also found them to be fast. I've also found it like it's also like cheaper compared to like using architects like in the Western countries because like
Mhm.
architects in the Western countries they may not be aware of like all the local laws. Um, then they also tend to be like more expensive. And even if
Mhm.
you use an architect like outside of Zimbabwe, you still need a Zimbabwean architect. Because at the end of the day, when you do submission for like your paperwork, what gets signed off is signed off by like a Zimbabwean architect, a Zimbabwean engineer. So like even if you engage in an architect outside of Zimbabwe, you still need to engage a local architect, who can then maybe use the inspiration from like your non-Zimbabwean like architect. So like yeah,
Yeah.
so for me, depending on like what I'm going for, I usually then decide and how fast I want those things and like how much money I'm wanting to spend. I decide whether I go with a Zimbabwean architect or a non-Zimbabwean architect. I've done both routes, so they're both like pros and cons, and also there's different amount of money you also spend when you do that.
Makes sense. Another short, rapid answer question
Yeah,
session. Hipped roof or flat roof?
flat roof,
Clay tiles or chroma deck?
chroma deck,
Face brick or plastering?
plastering,
Wallpaper or paint?
Paint.
Interesting. Anyway, in
But
terms of your construction, yeah,
sorry,
you have a comment.
I think I feel like everyone needs to know this. If you're gonna build, I didn't know this. I made this
Mhm,
mistake, so I want to make sure like everyone else knows.
mhm.
Flat roofs are very, very expensive. Stay away from flat roofs if you're not willing to spend the money. In some cases, the amount of money you spend on a roof might be the amount of money you might spend actually buying one or two properties in like high density areas. We're building our own house in like Arlington. We went with the flat roof because it looks amazing. The designs are great, but then the cost is insane. Going into this, I didn't realize that. I had to learn by doing it. So now I feel that it's my role to educate other people, which is also like one of the things that I want to make sure like I can start sharing all those lessons because now that I think about it, this is why in a lot of cases you don't see flat roofs that much. They're that expensive.
Yeah.
Is the reason.
Yeah,
And
I think, to your point, it's interesting because I think when I was, also building my house in Nyanga, was fortunate enough to actually talk to one of the architects who had worked on the new US Embassy building in Harare, and which is obviously a flat roof. But he warned me. He said, "You are building in Zimbabwe. There is no need for a flat roof. The Americans did it because they have the money to do it on their embassy, and they possibly have Black Hawk helicopters that might need to land there someday in an emergency. So you don't need to build a flat roof in Nyanga." I really wanted it, but that guy, he saved me and he steered me away from a flat roof. But he showed me the numbers and he told me how expensive it was. So, I'm glad you brought that up.
thank that person. Like for me, having a flat roof costed 4 or 5 times what a normal roof would have costed. So like yeah, stay away if you're not willing to spend the money.
Wow. That's a lot of multiplication being done there. But in terms of the other construction materials that you have, do you order most of these things, as long lead items, or do you just have a very perfected Japanese, just in time system that you only bring what's needed on site if it's going to be used tomorrow? Otherwise, we're not buying it and we're not keeping any inventory.
Yes, great question. I wish we had a perfected system. We don't. We're far from that. However, we don't buy everything beforehand. We literally buy things that we need as we need them. So we try to maybe buy things like a week in advance. Reasons for that being, first, when it comes to like storing things, it can be problematic. It also
Yeah.
happens like, if you buy everything at once, things could go missing. So we want to avoid that. And also from an expense standpoint, it's also just like better for us to just purchase things like as we need. So like we spend the money like when we absolutely have to spend that money. So it helps us, plan things better. It helps like manage the project a little bit better. So like yeah, we buy things usually the earliest like 3 to 7 days before we need them. And we just buy whatever we need at each stage.
And for the people who are working on the ground, I mean, the construction company that you actually contract to do this work, for someone who is just trying to work out how long a project might take, in general, do construction companies in Harare work 7 days a week, 5 days a week, or how often are you actually seeing this? And do you have to be there to sort of remind them that they need to come to the job, or you have been fortunate to work with contractors who are, very responsive and come and try to get your projects done on time?
Great question. I'll tell you it depends. I know that it's not always great to hear the answer that it depends, but yeah, it truly depends. Yes, why? I'll give an example. We're building in Arlington. We have like an amazing like contractor who literally they would work 7 days and then they would work 12-hour days.
Right.
They're that hardworking, they're that willing. They're also like family friends that we're using. But then even if they're willing to do that, Arlington Estate, this is another thing also which is important to know. I didn't know this when we started constructing. They also have their own rules for what time you can start construction and what time it has to end. So during the week, if you're doing construction in an estate, they have their own rules which govern
Yeah.
the times that you can work. And then for weekends, they also limit. I think on Sunday, you can only work until like 12 or something like that. So there, we have to like adhere to the rules. But if you're doing your own construction at your own house, not bound by any estates. You can set the rules. For example, for our Glenlone project, we don't have. So our contractors can work as much. And for us, we've been fortunate that we have a contractor who's always willing and they can do the hard work. I can tell you, like, our foundation, our house is very big. It's probably like 616 square meters. To do all the foundations and everything, it was like a few weeks, maybe 2-3 weeks, they were done with the whole thing. They were literally like working as much as hard as possible. And then I think we did the whole house, like for the main structure, like before the roof, I think in like 6 to 8 months, like for the house, which is like about 616 square meters, like they were done. So they've been working very, very hard. So we've been very fortunate there. But I mean, I've heard of cases where you have to chase people. Yeah. And then I would
And
say
still,
for us, the other thing also, when we started this company, I was fortunate that like my brother was in Zimbabwe and every single
yeah.
day he was on site, also inspecting and make sure like things are being done. Now that my brother is not in Zimbabwe, we also have an awesome project manager who's on site every single day. So that helps a lot.
Great. And in terms of paying the contractors, I mean, what is the system there? Is it that a client pays a lump sum amount and the contractor takes the risk whether they deliver on time and on budget, or is it really they keep on submitting the invoices for the labor and to the extent they're buying it for the materials, and then you just have to cover if there are any cost overruns in the project?
Yeah. So for us, like the model that like we go with, and before I answer that, I want to make sure like I share this. The other thing, if we're gonna do construction projects, make sure like you understand that there are timelines. At least in my experience, construction folks are not gonna be happy hearing this, and like anyone to do with real estate industry, they might not be happy to hear this. But I have to share with you, everyone, whenever they give you their timelines, they don't go with those timelines. If a builder tells you it's gonna take 2 months, I would budget 4 months. If an
Right.
interior designer tells you it's gonna take me 2 weeks to design this, I would budget 4 weeks to design it. That's just been our experiences. We've done like 3 projects so far, and this has been consistent. So now we've learned. So if you're doing any construction work, just know that if you're told 4 months, expect 6 to 8 months, so that you can adjust your expectations. I want to make sure I share that. Then to answer your question about how do we do payments. So for us, what we do is for our contractor, we discuss like for the whole structure, how much it costs. And then from there, we then say, okay, we then divide up how we do the payments. This is also another thing which people should know. We don't believe in paying the full amount to begin with, because if you do that, you no longer have leverage. And then
Yeah.
if you give them all the money, like your contractor, they may not finish the building and you don't get the work right. So you have to also incentivize them. So what we do is we give them like a third of the payment to begin with. And we do that because they also need to buy materials to do work, they need to hire, they need to do all that stuff, right? And then we have worked it out with our contractor that like every week we pay some amount. So we have milestones that we set every week, and then we also pay some amount every single week. And then we'll do the last payment when everything is completely done. So that's another thing that like earlier on we didn't realize this, and like we actually got scammed. The first company we approached to do like our designs, we didn't know at the point, and me being used to like the Western way of doing things, I'm not saying the Western countries are perfect, but usually if I pay for a service, I'm gonna get that service, even if I pay in
Yeah.
advance. So trusted a company which looked legit. They have their Instagram page, they have their website, they advertise a lot, they have a lot of followers, and I was like, okay, this looks legit. We then paid them everything in advance, at least for just doing the designs. And then as soon as we did that, the dates that like we were told were good, the designs, those dates were missed. Everything was missed by like a month and a half. And then we didn't have any leverage. Like we would message them, call them and all. And in the end, we ended up not getting every single thing that we had paid for. So for that, that was like a learning for us. And the only reason I'm sharing this mistake is so that, you can learn from me, you can laugh at me, but you can avoid that mistake for yourself. So like, yeah, never pay the full amount.
Well, I mean, I'm pretty sure we'll certainly learn from you, but not laugh at you. What about in terms of the permits themselves. I mean, how many permits in general are required for someone to build in Harare, for example? I mean, I'm guessing you need to engage the council or any other body that's required. Is there some environmental staff, deeds office, or council? How much in terms of offices that you have to visit for you to actually be able to start digging the ground?
Yes, this is a great question, and I'll answer it from two angles. So, for my experience, like we've built a house right in Arlington, or we're currently building a house there. So, if you're building an estate, in terms of permits, it's different. Or if you're doing like your own land, just like a single family home, the permits you require are different from if you're doing a cluster. So because I have experience in both, I'll tell you for both. So for our construction in Arlington, how the process worked is we first had to come up with the architectural designs and then have like a civil engineer or structural engineer come up with the designs. And then because Arlington as an estate, they also need to approve every single house because it has to meet their own standards. So we submitted to them, and then it took them some time to look up. It took them like about 3 weeks, 3 to 4 weeks until like we got a response. Should have taken like less, but yeah, we had some issues there and all end up being
Yep.
resolved. So those are the first set of permits that we had to get. Once Arlington had approved us, like the estate, then we went to the council. And then for the council, they saw like, I mean, Arlington had approved. Then we also made sure like, the council, like we're okay with it. And we made like all their requirements, like that they had said. For example, there's specific amount of meters you have to leave, right, between the boundary and the wall. And it's different for like the side walls compared to like the front. So you have to like make sure like, meeting all those rules and regulations. So like, yeah. And then once the council approves, then like, yeah, you can start like your construction. But at every single stage, someone from the council has to come and also like inspect. So that should take some time. For example, like once you've done the foundation, they come and inspect, then you actually dig, and then after you finish doing the actual foundation, then they come and check, then you build window level, then they come and check. So there's multiple inspection which happen throughout. That's like one way where you're building on an estate. And then if you're just doing it on your like on your own land, you probably just have to deal with like council. You don't have an estate which needs to approve, right? If it's your own land, it's independent. So in that case, everything from the council like stays the same. If you're doing cluster homes, that's a whole different beast. This is when like things like environmental comes in, and this process is like way longer. So if you're actually doing a cluster home, right, you first have to get permit for the clusters. Then once you get
Yep.
permit for the clusters, you also have to get construction permits. They're two different things. And for all those permits, you have to first, yeah, you come up with the designs, they have to be approved, and then you have to have like environmental folks who also come and like, figure out like what is the impact for like what you're doing like to the environment. They have to like approve, and then you have to have the civil engineering, the structural designs, everything like put. You also have to work with the council. There's a payment you have to make because if land might be zoned, maybe you're gonna do one, but now you're doing 6 homes, then you have to pay for that conversion from 1 to 6. So it's like a development fee. You also have to, yeah. So there's a lot of things which are now involved in the process. You also have to figure out biodigesters. If you don't have like a sewer system, you don't do septic tanks for cluster homes. So you have to figure out that, and then that also has to be approved. So if you're doing cluster homes, there's like so many approvals, and that process tends to be lengthy. We started our permit approval process in like June. We're still waiting for like all the permits to start like our clusters. And I imagine it's probably gonna take us like probably like nine months to like a year, just like for clusters. So it takes time. There's more things to be approved. The other thing that you also have to do too, you have to do soil tests, regardless of whether you're doing cluster or not. It's just good to understand like what is the type of soil that you have. This is very, very important. Because that then also determines how much you dig into the ground for your foundation, what is the material that you have to use for your foundation, to make sure like your structure is solid.
This is, it's a lot of very, very involved stuff, and I'm very sure viewers and listeners will be quite happy to hear this. In terms of, the process that you have since you're actually developing with the target of selling, how early do you involve, potential buyers or, the ultimate buyer in this? Are you building a shell and then you involve them in terms of the designing, or are you actually building, designing, and furnishing, and then you only bring in the type of clientele who is interested after looking at it when it's fully complete?
Yeah, so for this, the truth is like we're still also like really figuring out like how we should do it. Like right now, what we're currently doing is we have the designs, we've made the decks for like what we're gonna offer. So right now we're currently like speaking with people like, hey, look, there's this development we intend to do. If you're interested, like let us know. So we're already working with buyers and like talking to them about it before we even start because the payment process is taking like a very, very like long time. And then the other thing also, we want to sell off plan as well to like, help put the funding of this so that we don't self-fund everything because we're doing like other projects, right? And we've been self-funding a lot of things, but at least for the cluster homes, we want to sell them off plan such that we can do construction using some of those funds from there compared to us having all our money like locked in. And then we have thought about building that like, model home for people to see. So I think once we get the permits, we'll probably try to do that. So like, people can see. But the good thing is we already have a structure in Arlington that we've built. So if people want to know the quality and the materials that we're actually doing, we can also take them there because for all our cluster homes, we're going to still use the same builders. We're also still using the same interior designs and we're still using the same suppliers for stuff. So if people really want to see a model home, they can also use like our Arlington estate property to get a sense of that.
Outside real estate, are you in anything else, or for now you're just focusing all your time, energy, and money in real estate?
Yeah, I mean, I've had like other interests and other things that like I've wanted to do, but for now, I realize I'm not as good at like multitasking. So now I'm just putting all my eggs in like real estate. What I've said to myself is like I would rather give myself like, okay, I have this years to focus on real estate and see like what I can make out of it. Then I'll reevaluate. If I'm happy, things are going like as we want and all that stuff, continue doing that. But if I want to pivot and do something else, then I can check. I can change. But I usually like to just like focus on one thing at a time because like I mean there's also like other things outside of real estate that like I have to take care of. So yeah. Right now the
Yeah,
time I
yeah.
have I can only devote to real estate.
And in terms of location, I know you're doing work in Zimbabwe, but are you exploring even within the real estate sector? Are you exploring other opportunities within the SADC region, or are you still very much focused on real estate in Zimbabwe and not looking anywhere else in real estate within the region?
Yeah. So we have thought about real estate in South Africa. Right now,
Hmm.
we just haven't done it because we haven't had the time to like actually do all the research and also like have
Yeah.
people on the ground because I mean we're doing this like whilst I'm in the US. So we started with Zimbabwe because grew up there, have family there. So it's a little bit like easier to figure out and come up with a system for like how do we get builders, how do we get interior designers, architects and engineers and all that. If we try to do the same in South Africa or like, I don't know, Kenya or like Zambia, I mean it's possible, but it's just that for us we don't have like as much like connection, so we're not doing that as of yet. The other thing that we've thought about also is just trying to do this like in America, such that and my thought there being like I would like to see like how houses are developed in America, what technology that they use. Then I can see things that I can actually learn from here and implement in Zimbabwe to try and see like how I can fast track things. Because there are things we still take like a very long time. When I'm doing in Zimbabwe, and I don't know if those things take a long time. Maybe that's just how it is, but maybe yeah, they figured out how to do those things faster. So I was in why US because that's where I'm currently, right? So I think it's a little bit easier. And also in the US, I also know people who are into construction and they're builders. So I also have that network too. So yeah, that's the other project which we might be working on maybe in the next year or two.
Wow, this is certainly exciting. But when you mentioned the next year or two, I just realized that in the next year or two, we're also going to have something big in the US. You're a big football fan. I mean, football, like as we call it at home, and not soccer as it is called here. But you're a big football fan. Are you planning to take some time off to attend these upcoming matches this year and next year for the World Cup? What is your schedule going to be like for you to balance the living and the working there in terms of football coming to America?
Yeah, so for me, I think I always have time for football, something I'm passionate about. To give you some context, I've gone for every World Cup since Russia. So I was in Russia in 2018 for the World Cup. I went to Qatar in 2022 for the World Cup. I'm very excited that, we have the World Cup here in the US. I mean, I know it's also in Mexico and like Canada for some of the games. But yeah, the plan is to make time and also go and also keep up the trend. I also have friends who I get to travel with, and I always love hanging out with my friends. So it's something that like we devote time to do. So that's the plan.
And you play football in person as well, and as well as playing FIFA online. Is that right?
Yeah, yeah, I try to play football as much as possible, just, distress and like yeah. So like every week I try to play games. Yeah. And I also
And
used to play FIFA a lot. Lately I haven't been able to have like as much time, but when I usually hang out with my friends, we usually do play FIFA.
and which version do you play? The one that actually can be paused, or the one that's continuous and cannot be paused when
It,
when visitors show up?
it can be paused. Yeah, FIFA can.
It cannot be paused.
Yeah.
All right. I mean, if some listener or viewer is watching or listening to this and they want to connect with you, in terms of your property company or just getting life advice, where can they find you?
Yeah, so you can use my Gmail account, like my email, Aubrey Mago, AubreyMago @gmail.com. Feel free to also connect with me like on LinkedIn. I'm more than happy to, talk if you're interested in real estate or working in tech, computer science, technology, or anything. I'm always happy to chat. And if you think I can help with anything, I'm also more than happy to help. Just let me know.
Well, yeah, I'll certainly make sure that I leave some of your contact details in the comments, or rather the description for this video, depending on where people end up finding this, whether it's a podcast or it's a YouTube video. But two questions that we always end up with, we always end with on this podcast is the first one is obviously since this is the Afrophile pod where people love Africa and appreciate it, I ask, what is it that makes you excited about Africa? And then the second thing is, why is it that you love Africa? So where is your love from, and what makes you optimistic about the continent?
Yeah, my love for me in Africa is just, I just love the culture. I mean, I've traveled to a lot of African countries, and for me, there's just like a different level of peace that like I just feel as soon as like a plane lands on the African continent. For me, I just feel like things are just different. And for me, it's a place that I have this belonging. Living in the US is great, but I always feel like a foreigner, regardless of me having been here for like, 14 years. And Africa always feels like home. I mean, I have friends from Ghana, I have friends from like Namibia, like Kenya, and like a lot of places. And every time I have friends from South Africa, every time I've gone to like African countries, I've always had a great time. So like I love that, and I've always had that belonging when I'm there. And then I'm very optimistic because when it comes to Africa, like there's a lot of like great people with brilliant minds, people like tackling a lot of like hard problems. There's a lot of like opportunities, and just like hearing about different stories for like what things people are doing in different African countries just gives me a sense of like optimism and like pride. I'm always rooting for my African brothers and sisters, regardless of like whatever they undertake. And I'm very optimistic too because of the resilience that, I see a lot of like African brothers and African sisters having. So that's why I'm very optimistic about the continent.
Well, that does it for this pod, for this week at least. But we'll return again next week with more interesting conversations coming from people who love Africa on this Afrophile pod. So thanks everyone. This podcast is for entertainment purposes only and should not be relied upon for any other purpose. The information provided does not constitute, nor should it be interpreted as, financial advice. The hosts and the guests participate in their personal capacities and do not represent their employers or any affiliated organizations. Any opinion expressed is entirely their own. Experiences and viewpoints shared may differ from those of other investors or individuals. Past performance is not indicative of future results. Furthermore, this podcast, including all the information contained herein, may not be copied, reproduced, republished, or distributed in whole or in part without the prior written consent of the producer, Mr. Maro of Africa. The Afrophile Pod is recorded, produced, and edited by Maro of Africa. Tafazwa Brian serves as our executive producer, while our theme music was sourced by Taf Maro. Brian Maro is our global head of podcast. Thank you for listening to the Afrophile Pod. We'll be back next week with more reasons to be bullish on Africa.